Hello, my name is Caitlin Simmons. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about school funding and how there's kind of two different ways to fund a school. Well, there's multiple ways, but I'm focusing on two. One is going to be the more traditional way that schools are funded today, and then the other is going to be an adequacy type funding, and I'll get more into that later. So why it's important? School funding is incredibly important because, as you know, public schools aren't funded um, by people paying to go to the school, they're paying taxes. Well, in colonial America, schools were funded based off of property tax, which was really convenient at the time because the most of the schools, since they're locally run, were off with like a lot of people were farmers, so they had lots of land, and so in that case, they were able to bring in a lot more money because the property tax was higher, and so people were able to give more money to the schools, and they were better. So unfortunately, that's the way that it's done today too, and the reason why that can be a bad thing is because the property tax in some counties are higher than they are in other counties. So you might have an area where the property tax is high, and therefore the school has a lot of funding, and so the schools have better computers and more textbooks and better schools. Whereas the schools that are in areas that are less economically advantaged, they are going to have worse off schools, not as good at textbooks, maybe no computers, things like that. An example of this is in San Antonio, there was a case called the Rodriguez case. It was Rodriguez versus San Antonio, and this was in 1973. Mr. Rodriguez, he had two children that went to a school called Edgewood, and Edgewood was in the lower income area. And right next to them was Kirby School, the school district, and that's the Alamo Heights area, and they had a lot more income. So his kids at the school ended up they ended up having like very few textbooks that were super super old. Half of the school was out because like it wasn't safe to be in, and then they also didn't have computers, like not even typewriters. Whereas the Alamo Heights School had brand new computers, they had top-of-the-notch textbooks. Also, they had certified teachers, whereas the Edgewood district didn't have certified teachers. So there's a big difference in the funding that the schools get just based off of even property tax. And so that's why it's kind of not a fair system, because you have schools that end up having more money versus schools that have like very little. When you just base it off of property tax. So he took it to the courts and he lost the first case, but then they started another one, and then there was one that happened in California that ended up getting some people's attention. And what they did was it was what's called the Robin Hood reformers. They went out and, just like Robin Hood the character, took money from the richer districts and gave it to the poorer ones. And the only problem with that was that when they did that, the richer districts became equally as bad as the poorer districts. So it was, rather than making everything better, it made them all equally worse. So that wasn't good either. So that's what the troubles are whenever you have something that's based off of property tax, and that's the way that schools are generally funded right now. However, in Maryland, they're doing an adequacy funding system. So basically what that means is they decided with the Thornton Bridge to Excellence Act, where they had a researcher go out and found out that the successful schools in their area were getting about $6,000 per student, whereas the lower income districts were ending up having to get $4,500 extra per student just to be even remotely successful. So the act had them invest 80% of additional funds to schools just from like the state funding. So this act created a finance structure and funding formula which links resources to students' needs and distributes 74% of state aid versus local wealth So poorer school systems receive relatively more state aid than wealthier school systems. The act also contains strong accountability factors, and that was from the Maryland Department of Education. And so they basically are taking this adequacy approach where they're trying to get it to where all the schools are at the same level rather than getting the same funding necessarily, and the schools that aren't doing as well get more funding. So that's kind of the way that they're trying to do that. And to keep it fair is they're having high standards for each of these schools. So you have to be able to prove that you're performing better based off the funds that you're giving. They have that, but they don't have it. So they found out the reason why this is so important too, and how it really kind of affects the community, is that for every $1 spent in taxes for a school, $1.53 is given back to the community. So it brings up the value of your community. So the more money that you spend in school, the more money you're spending, the better you're making the community. So it really kind of pays off to spend more to make better schools. So if I had to choose one, I think I would choose the adequacy funding, because it not only betters the school, but it also betters the community. And so that's what I have.